who is John Beutler, who is air pollution specialist and who will be assisted by his colleagues from CARB, Lezlie, Kimura, Szeto, and Carey, Knecht. And this webinar is arranged by the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency, Naturvårdsverket, and in cooperation with the EONET Group Mobility Systems, which is a part of the European Environment Agency. My name is Joanna Dickinson. I work as an expert on sustainable mobility at the Swedish Environmental Research Institute, and I look forward to moderating this webinar. Sorry, I had some technical problem. Yeah. I would first like to mention that this webinar is recorded, so it will be possible to look at it afterwards as well. And I would like to remind you to keep your microphones off during presentations, but feel free to keep the cameras on. And we are joined today in this webinar by an audience of planners and policymakers from both local and regional and national level in Sweden, as well as environment and transport authorities and ministries from all over Europe, and also from North America, and some other organizations too. So this will be an exciting afternoon. A brief look at the agenda. Do that. So. First, we will get a brief introduction from Mats Björshäll and Hanna Roos from the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency. And then John Beutler, who is air pollution specialist from the California Air Resources Board, will present California policies and planning to reduce personal vehicle use. After his presentation, Håkan Johansson, who is a sustainable mobility expert from Trivector Traffic in Sweden, will give some reflections from a Swedish and European perspective. And we will have, after that, time for questions and discussion. And then we will have the possibility to ask questions to not only John, but also to Lezlie and to Carey. And I look forward to hear all your presentations and then a fruitful discussion. So now, please, Mr. Mats Björshäll, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joanna. The Swedish EPA is our country's central authority for climate and environmental issues. We evaluate the environmental and climate policy and provide the government with the basis and proposals for policy instruments and development of climate policy. Transport accounts for a third of Swedish greenhouse gas emissions. The Swedish target is to reduce CO2 emissions from domestic travel with 70% to 2030 compared to 2010. There are three key instruments in this transition. Change to biofuels, electrification, and the third one is to reduce traffic volumes. Keeping traffic volumes low is necessary for the climate, and there's a long list of co-benefits that we miss with the other two cornerstones in transformation, biofuels and electrification. But it's difficult to get political parties to adopt ideas or strategies to reduce road traffic. So we see a great value in listening to countries, states, or cities that have a clear ambition to reduce car driving and learn from their experiences, both regarding policy instruments and strategies, including how to succeed in gaining acceptance. So we are very excited to hear your story. Thank you. And now over to my colleague, Hanna.
I will now hand over to Hanna Roos from the SCPA.
Thank you. So my name is Hannah, and I'm working as a coordinator of international cooperations at the Swedish EPA. So the Swedish EPA has a number of international cooperations. We have worked with the state of California for several years through knowledge exchange regarding both transport efficiency and emissions trading systems. We have a very fruitful cooperation with California, and we're happy to work together, not least as we both share high ambitions in reducing emissions. So by sharing information on our targets, actions, plans, and challenges, we can learn from each other and get new insights in how we can reduce emissions and reach our targets, which is the purpose of this webinar today. So on that note, I would like to hand over to John Beutler, right, from California Air Resources Board.
Thank you, Hannah. So let me introduce John Beutler from the California Air Resources Board. Please, John, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me share my PowerPoint here. You should be seeing the first slide.
Yeah, we see it.
Okay, great. Great. Okay, so yes, I'm John Beutler. As noted in the introduction, I'm in the Sustainable Communities section of the California Air Resources Board, which is part of the California Environmental Protection Agency. I have the privilege of working with a team of land use, environmental, and transportation planners and engineers to promote land use patterns in transportation systems in California that help broaden Californians' choices for getting from place to place. In the next 30 minutes or so, I'll provide an overview of California's climate change scoping plan and our SB 375 program for sustainable communities planning. I will talk about the program's importance to California's climate strategy, how implementation has been going, and share some examples of regional and state activities to support implementation, with special attention to the land use and housing components of the work. Here today, we have other CARB people, as you know, who will help answer questions after the presentation, including Carey Knecht and Lezlie Kimura Szeto, as noted in the introduction. Both Carey and Lezlie have been involved in these issues in California for many years, including involvement in the SB 375 program from its beginning. The California Air Resources Board, which we call CARB, works in many ways to create cleaner air. Our work in regional planning is about creating sustainable communities. In the United States, decisions about land use and transportation are often made by different authorities working at different geographic scales, including local, regional, state, and even national. Coordinating between these decisions can at times create challenges. In CARB's vision, sustainable communities will coordinate transportation and land use in ways that create sufficient housing for all Californians and promote opportunities for walking, bicycling, and using transit. Much of the legal basis for CARB's work to create sustainable communities comes from the state legislature's mandate to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which I will also call GHGs, in order to reduce climate change. In California, laws have names beginning with AB or SB. This simply means that the law originated in one part of our legislature or the other, with AB for Assembly Bill and SB for Senate Bill. So AB 32 from 2006, the California Global Warming Solutions Act, requires CARB to develop a climate change scoping plan that describes the approach California will take to reduce GHGs. The first scoping plan was approved by CARB's board in 2008, and AB 32 requires that the scoping plan must be updated at least every 5 years. The most recent scoping plan from November 2022 assesses progress towards California's 2030 GHG reduction target and lays out a path to achieve carbon neutrality no later than 2045. Much of what I will share with you in the first portion of this presentation is described in Scoping Plan's Appendix E, which is the Sustainable and Equitable Communities Appendix. Regarding the need for the Sustainable Communities Appendix in the Scoping Plan, in 2019, the transportation sector accounted for over 50% of GHG emissions in California, more than in Sweden, apparently, making it by far the single largest sector of carbon emissions in the state. we divide transportation sector emissions into 3 categories: technology, fuels, and vehicle travel. Meeting state targets will require actions across all 3 of these categories. Technology for us refers to the vehicles themselves, as well as refueling infrastructure for those vehicles. Fuels refers to the energy source used to power the vehicles and the facilities that produce the fuel. And vehicle travel is measured as vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, and is a product of development patterns and available transportation options. California has a broad set of strategies for achieving the necessary reductions. In this talk, we are focusing on reducing the need to drive, so I won't go into detail on the other strategies, but I did want to note that CARB has been developing a range of regulations to meet climate goals. For example, all new passenger vehicles sold in California by 2035 must be zero emission. Buses, trucks, and off-road equipment will also increasingly use zero emission technology. It's important to note that California's climate change scoping plan has included sustainable communities since its inception, and the 2022 plan update reaffirmed the need for these types of strategies to address California's transportation emissions. This point is important because we often get asked the question, since California is a leader in clean vehicle regulations, won't the state's vehicle emission regulations take care of the need for GHG reductions? In other words, won't zero-emission vehicles solve greenhouse gas emissions? They will not, unfortunately. Our latest planning scenarios show that zero-emission vehicles alone are not enough to achieve our air quality and climate goals. We also have to reduce how much people need to drive. The black line in this graph from the 2022 scoping plan shows actual vehicle miles traveled per person per day from 2010 to 2019. What we see is VMT per person was increasing, not decreasing. The green segmented line shows the targeted decrease in average VMT per person needed across California to achieve our climate goals. The target is that compared to 2019 driving, people will drive approximately 25% less by 2030 and 30% less by 2045. Another key message in the appendix is that the same kinds of places that make it easy to drive less also reduce greenhouse gas emissions beyond the transportation sector. Low VMT environments are usually a product of more compact development patterns with shorter travel distances. These environments further reduce greenhouse gases, considering greenhouse gas emissions from building construction and household usage are reduced by urban infill compared to low-density greenfield development, because of differences in unit types, sizes, and development locations. Development closer to job and retail centers leads to lower GHG emissions associated with road and utility infrastructure construction and maintenance. And infill reduces the conversion of natural and agricultural lands into low-density development, thereby protecting California's ability to sequester carbon in the soils and biomass of croplands and grasslands. Also, an important factor for CARB is that the same strategies that can reduce the need to drive also can help improve social and racial justice. California's low-density, high VMT development patterns are, to a large extent, the product of racist policies and practices that aimed to segregate communities of color and benefit white suburban commuters. These policies created and continue to exacerbate inequality, underinvestment, and limited access to opportunities for communities of color. Changing how we build and connect communities is an opportunity to address existing inequities by making livable, affordable homes with easy multimodal connections to jobs, services, open space, and education available to all Californians, not just the white and the wealthy. To address these critical challenges, we devised a framework of action structured around 4 strategy areas. Plan and invest in a sustainable transportation system, manage the use of the transportation system, shape the deployment of new mobility options such as scooters and e-bikes, and improve alignment of land use planning and development with climate and equity goals. Each of these strategies is structured around 3 elements. First, have a vision for the year 2045 that supports meeting carbon neutrality goals while advancing equity. Next, identify policy objectives that need to be achieved to deliver the vision for that strategy area. And third, undertake actions that need to be activated to implement those policy objectives. In the next slides, we will highlight the highest priority objectives we have identified through our process. Meeting our climate goals requires a wide range of strategies, and they are all important, but to be brief, I will highlight only a few. Meeting our climate goals requires a wide range of strategies, and so for example, for the transportation planning and investments strategy area, the first issue that needs to be tackled is that many roadway projects scheduled for construction will increase VMT. Thus, there is an urgent need to reimagine those projects. Also, we need to offer alternatives to driving that are convenient and affordable. So here we identify the need to fund a substantial improvement of public transit services across the state, doubling coverage and frequencies. In this system management strategy area, our vision is to establish a transportation system and a use of our roadways that prioritizes people movement over vehicle movement. So one core objective is implementing roadway pricing strategies that promote a more efficient use of cars while emphasizing equity considerations. We understand that Sweden has congestion charges in Stockholm and Gothenburg already. In California, the 4 largest metropolitan planning organizations are planning for pricing strategies, and it is essential that we support those and see those strategies implemented. Another key objective here is to reconfigure our right-of-ways of our roads to give transit priority so that it is not bogged down in traffic. We believe new mobility can complement transit and other broad coverage and offer broad coverage and a suite of diverse services that respond to Californians' diverse traveling needs and support the more car-free or car-light lifestyles. But there are also key risks around this sector. For instance, we see a need to put guardrails around the arrival of autonomous vehicles, which are projected to lead to significant VMT increases. We need to be proactive to prevent potential harmful impacts to our climate and equity goals. Similarly, thinking about transportation network companies like Uber, we want those services to acknowledge their VMT impact, to incentivize pooling and working with transit more decisively in the service of offerings and fares. Finally, for land use, we see the need to prioritize infill development so that origins and destinations are closer together, making any trip shorter and making transit, walking, and biking more viable options. Another key objective to support low VMT land use and development patterns would be ensuring alignment in land use, housing, transportation, and conservation planning between regional plans and local plans, which unfortunately is not often the case today. Also, accelerating the production of affordable housing is key to solving both the climate crisis and the housing crisis. So, SB 375 means Senate Bill 375. It was originally proposed in the California Senate and was assigned the number 375. The number has no other meaning. The actions of the SB 375 program are rooted at the regional level. For context, on the left, we have Sweden and California overlaid. They are remarkably similar in size and shape, though perhaps not in weather. On the right is a map showing the 18 regions in California, which are in orange. The other areas in green are more rural. The 18 regions in orange were originally designated by the federal government in Washington, D.C. as a place to distribute federal transportation money throughout the country. They are called Metropolitan Planning Organizations, or MPOs. The U.S. government requires each MPO to produce a regional transportation plan every 4 years. When California lawmakers enacted SB 375, they used the existing system of MPOs as the geography where the law would be implemented. Under SB 375, CARB sets greenhouse gas emission, sets GHG sets a passenger vehicle GHG emissions reduction target for each California MPO. To meet the target, the MPOs develop regional plans called Sustainable Community Strategies, or SCSs, which identify land use and transportation strategies to reduce emissions. The Sustainable Community Strategies are an integral part of regional transportation plans prepared and adopted by MPOs and are routinely updated every 4 or 5 years. The SCSs must be approved by the California Air Resources Board. SB 375 provides some incentives, which I have listed here, and over time, certain state funding pots have either included eligibility or prioritization criteria for projects that align with the Sustainable Community Strategies. However, the Sustainable Community Strategies just draw a blueprint. Implementation of SCSs would require actions by many actors, the state government, the many local cities and towns in each region, and companies that build housing or provide transportation options. Overall, implementation is falling short. On this slide, we have a variety of things required for an SCS. I won't read all of these out. In general, the 3 basic things the SCS must include are a forecast of regional development patterns. In other words, a map where new homes and businesses are expected to be built. The development pattern must be integrated with the planned transportation network, and the plan must achieve the regional greenhouse gas emissions reduction target if implemented. The targets for greenhouse gas reduction come from a public process that CARB must undertake every 4 or 8 years. The target years are set in the law, 2020 and 2035. In other words, the years which people must reach their target. However, as we know, the travel patterns in 2020 were disrupted by COVID-19. Targets were previously set in processes that ended in 2010 and 2018. CARB is now beginning the process of setting new targets, and that process will be complete in 2026. MPO regions have submitted multiple SCSs during the SB 375 program. In their SCS, a region could use a variety of strategies to meet greenhouse gas targets. Of the 35 plus SCSs CARB has reviewed, all demonstrated an ability to meet the regional targets, and some exceeded them if implemented. Each SCS is unique, reflecting the issues and priorities of a region, as well as economic and political forces at play that shape the planning SCS development process and its implementation. CARB staff has observed that SCS strategies generally fit into 4 overall groups shown here: land use, transportation, pricing, and EV infrastructure and new mobility. The most effective plans combine multiple strategies and adjust as information from performance monitoring becomes available. A coordination example is land use in coordination with transportation. This can be a combination of land use planning and associated transportation investments that support increased transit, bike, and pedestrian travel. Over the iterations of SCSs, MPOs may not always propose new strategies. Many strategies are carried over between SCSs. Strategies also do not necessarily serve a single purpose, such as the co-benefits mentioned previously. While the primary intent is oriented on meeting greenhouse gas targets, many address changing travel behaviors, trends and patterns, and/or safety concerns, offer climate adaptation or resilience, and other issues that emerge or disappear over time. Here is an example from the SCS of the Southern California Association of Governments 2020 SCS. And this is the Los Angeles region. This SCS assumes increases in growth within the regionally identified priority areas, which include job centers, high-quality transit areas, and special neighborhood mobility areas. The plan also avoids growth in constrained areas, including open spaces, areas subject to sea level rise, and farmlands. The modeling also discourages growth in the wildland-urban interface, grazing lands, 500-year floodplains, and areas of very high severity fire risk. These areas were identified during the scenario development process and were refined during SCAG's modeling process. Most MPOs in this process consider whether to redirect jurisdictional growth into priority growth areas and end up assuming more growth in infill development areas like this plan. The challenge with implementation of SCS strategies is that under SB 375, they are considered regional guidelines, and they do not supersede existing regulations or protections or local land use policy and authority, which normally rests with individual cities, and there are 191 individual cities in the Los Angeles region. Implementation of the plans is difficult. Here are 2020 SCS includes an action to support its local governments in creating enhanced infrastructure financing districts to finance construction or rehabilitation of public infrastructure. This will support economic development and reduce the costs of housing construction. SACOG, or Sacramento 2020 SCS, includes actions to implement demonstration projects through its programs that encourage infill development and revitalization of commercial corridors. MTC ABAG, or San Francisco region, includes many land use and housing strategies that will be supported by the new Bay Area Housing Finance Authority. This agency will work to protect current residents against displacement, preserve existing housing affordable for low and middle income residents, and produce new housing at all income levels, though especially affordable housing. The agency is currently working on 5 pilot projects to support these goals. And finally, SANDAGS, which is the San Diego region, SCS includes new housing acceleration program to promote activities that accelerate the production of housing as well as development around its identified mobility hubs. The region supports this program by allocating over $6.8 million received through funding from the state of California. More recently, not on the slide, but additional state mechanisms have been put into place that support SCS implementation by seeking to improve the alignment of state climate goals with regional housing, transportation, and equity needs. One of these is the Climate Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure, which works to align state transportation funding and incentives to meet VMT reduction and climate goals in an equitable way. Also, the California Climate Investments Program puts billions of dollars to work funding housing, transportation, natural working lands preservation, and more. Also, the Regional Early Action Planning Grants 2.0 program provides funding to accelerate implementation of SCSs for infill housing and reduction of VMT. And finally, the Pro Housing Designation Program provides incentives to cities and counties in the form of additional points or other preference in the scoring of competitive housing, community development, and infrastructure programs in the state. Related to the thought that implementation of the SCSs under SB 375 is not mandated or enforced, in 2017, the SB 150 law was passed, requiring CARB to report to our legislature on implementation and MPO progress in meeting the SB 375 regional targets. We call these the progress reports or the 150 reports. CARB prepared the first 150 report in 2018 and issued our latest report in 2023. For this report, our staff analyzed data for over 24 metrics on the ground to help tell the story regarding SCS implementation. The first overarching finding is that statewide per capita GHG emissions from passenger vehicles and per capita VMT continued to increase, though GHG emissions are down slightly from 2005, as we can see in this graph. Reducing vehicular emissions has proved challenging for nearly all regions across the state, with 2019 data indicating nearly all regions were not on track to meet their 2020 targets CARB had set for them, though the actual emissions were lower due to the effects of the pandemic in 2020. CARB will update this chart periodically, even between SB 150 reports. Considering potential reasons for the rise in VMT, we found that the latest SCSs were planning significant investment in transit compared to roads, but in 3 of the 4 largest regions in the state, 18 to 25% of the planned total funding is still allocated to the construction of new roadway capacity, which we know increases driving. This chart shows the proportions of transit and roadway spending in the 4 most urban regions, which together represent about 82% of California's population. Capital spending on roads is shown by the solid yellow bars, and capital spending for new transit capacity is shown by the solid blue bars. On the land use and housing side of things, home construction fell short in both number and types. California's housing is mostly single-family homes. Many SESs plan for increasing multifamily housing, adding smaller homes on smaller lots, and increasing housing near transit. Work is required to implement the strategies in the SESs on this, addressing issues with both numbers of units and housing types. As shown in the left figure, housing unit production continues to fall short of projected housing demand in number and types, although we see multifamily homes becoming a larger share. For housing affordability, the chart on the right shows housing for very low and low-income households is not a large proportion of total production. When people cannot find affordable homes near jobs and other essential destinations, they may have to live in more remote locations and travel longer distances. Finally, many SESs rely on land use strategies that promote people living closer to key destinations so that trips are shorter and people can shift to other modes than vehicles. Thus, for the latest 150 report, CARB analyzed a new metric, which is the percent of people who have access to 4 key destinations within 15 minutes by walking. These destinations are the nearest park or open space, an educational facility, a transit stop, and a grocery store. We found that only in the San Francisco region on the far left do about 40% of people have access to these destinations within even 15 minutes by walking, and in all other regions, the proportion is about 25% or less, and sometimes much less. Like some other metrics, walkability affects not only the amount of driving, but is also crucial to people's quality of life, health, and economic opportunities, particularly people who do not drive, do not have access to a car, or are burdened by significant transportation costs. The 150 progress report showed several things overall. Regardless of the success of planning for GHG reduction, there should be a stronger focus on implementation. There must be more tools to create this implementation, and we require better alignment between different entities so that we are all working toward the same goals. Our overall insights are: implementation has been difficult and uneven. More attention is required. Current incentives have not been effective in gaining implementation. The old way of doing things, such as building new highways and developing at low densities, is hard to change. The SB 375 program has done a lot to raise the level of conversation on these issues and has had some implementation success, however. In the end, though, there is much more work that needs to be done. So I thank you so much for your attention. And when we reach that point in today's webinar, I and the other CARB people here will be happy to answer any questions that you may have. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I will then be happy to give the microphone to Håkan Johansson, who is with us, who is a Swedish expert in sustainable mobility and transport planning. Håkan, are you there?
Yes, I am. I have to put on the microphone. And then I should share some slides also. So, okay. Do you see some slides now? Or? Okay, yes. Good. Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. It is always interesting to get a perspective on the strategies in your own country by comparing with other countries. we have in a research project studied other countries in Europe that have set up goals to also to reduce traffic. And I would use those examples also as a reflection of what we have heard, not only the Swedish perspective. Actually, those countries have also been presented in similar webinars as this as we have today. Let's start with that there is a wide consensus that we need 3 elements for a sustainable and a robust transformation of the transport sector. This has been said of, for example, by IPCC and OECD, and also our national Swedish Climate Policy Council. And I saw also that you had these, even if you call it somewhat else in California, it is essentially these 3 elements. And of course, regarding a goal, you of course need a goal for greenhouse gas emissions reduction, not only for the country as a whole, but also on the transport sector. And as Mats said in the introduction, that in Sweden, the parliament has decided on a goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transport sector by 70% by 2030 compared to 2010, and to be climate neutral in 2045, as also in California. And of course, when you have these ambitious targets, you also need all these 3 elements, so otherwise you will not meet the goals, as we also heard. Unfortunately, the current government in Sweden has almost entirely focused on electrification of the transport sector, and the climate plan that has recently been presented by the government have been severely criticized by the Swedish Climate Policy Council for that it's not going to meet decided climate goals by the parliament, and that the current politic actually is increasing the emissions, at least in the near time, from transport. And regarding the climate footprint of the infrastructure, that is something that the Swedish Transport Administration is working with, and also have ambitious goals and requirements in procurement. The goals is to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions in a life cycle perspective, including materials, with 60% to 2030 compared to 2015, and 80% to 2035, and climate neutral in 2040, actually 5 years before the national goal. And I will focus on a transport efficient society to reduce the mileage of cars and trucks and also aviation. And for this, you need 3 elements that is based on our international looking on the different countries here. And actually, as what you see here is also the strategies of these countries for meeting these objectives. So you need 3 things: a common goal and vision for a transport efficient society, and invest in infrastructure that contributes to and fits into this transport efficient society, and strengthen the cooperation for a transport efficient society. And we'll go more into detail of these. Regarding the national goal for traffic, these 5 countries has targets to reduce car traffic with for Ireland and Scotland here with 20% to 2030 compared to 2019. And that I understood that that's the same also that in California. And then you see the other countries' targets also. What interesting also for these countries is that they not only have a national goal for the traffic, but also that they break down that to what is the target for larger cities. For example, in Edinburgh and Glasgow and Oslo, they have a reduction of 30% to 2030, and that is also goals that Stockholm and Gothenburg also actually have in Sweden, in that same area. And of course, it's very important that the goals and the vision is broadly politically anchored, and that they also a starting point for policy and planning. So it's not only a goal that we do not really use. Unfortunately, we do not have these kind of goals in Sweden on a national level. There are at the municipality level, and also some regions have this kind of goals. The background to these goals, and I think this is very important, is that, okay, to get up to the figure of 20% reduction, this is something that I calculate from the climate goal that I have for example, for transport. But then they also, all countries, they also see that they motivate the goal also from a broader sustainability perspective. And for example, for Norway, that is one of the countries in the world that, except maybe California, that have the highest share of electric vehicles. They still they are pointing that this target on the zero growth of car traffic in the urban areas is also something that is applied for electric vehicles. And coming to the infrastructure, when you have this kind of goals to reduce car traffic, there is actually no need for new road capacity. It would actually be responsible to use the tax money to build more capacity when you have a goal to reduce the car traffic. And for the transport efficient society, you should not invest in roads that reduce travel time for car, since that will lead to more traffic. We have to say that in most countries here, the goals and strategies are quite young, and the influence on the transport infrastructure planning is not been very clear yet. But in Wales and Austria, it is very clear. And I would actually say also that you see some evidence of influence in Norway. In both Wales and Austria, a number of road and highway projects have been stopped since they counteract the goals to reduce the car traffic, and also because building them would mean a waste of money. It is important that when you stop these plans that could have been on the table for decades, that you have a dialogue on what you do instead. Otherwise, you could end in an opposition that could jeopardize the world strategy. In Sweden, in Sweden, there's still large road projects that motivated by capacity to reduce travel time for cars, and even if the largest share of the investments in a national plan are put on railway. It's about 80% of the investments in a national put on railway and 20% on roads. I think that was the same share as in California, if I understood it right. And as you said, there are powerful interest in continuing the old ways of building cities, such as suburban development and highway building. I really recognize this from Sweden also, and I really hope both that you and we can turn this ship towards sustainable horizon. And my last slide is about the collaboration to actually reach these goals. To reduce car traffic, you need a large number of measure and policy instruments on the different levels. Since no level has a control over all measures and policy instruments, cooperation is needed. You need, and regarding the policy instruments, you need measures, you need a good balance between carrots and sticks. And do not be afraid of using sticks. Without them, you will not meet the goal. And but without the carrots, you will neither get acceptance nor social sustainability. You mentioned the road taxes that you work with at the congestion charging, and that is very good. If you do not have the possibility of using working with that, simpler way could be using parking fees and reducing number of parking places. That is also effective, and probably you work with both. On the different countries here, I would say that Norway has come farthest here. They have agreements between the national, regional, and local level, urban environmental agreements, and they have this goal here as a central part in those agreements. And it includes land use policy, investments in public transport, cycling infrastructure, and they also have road taxes in all these urban areas. We could also see in Scotland some good examples of collaboration between the different levels, even if it's not as formal as in Norway. So that was my reflections, also both from a Swedish perspective, but also on some examples from other good examples from other European countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have started in the chat and written a question, but I think we have a question here from other participants. So I think we'll start with them first. Misha from OECD. Would you like to ask your question in the air, please?
Yes. So
thank you.
In the context of a case study, we're currently interested in action being taken on the sub-national level. And you mentioned some car demand management targets being set on the regional level in Sweden. And I was curious to hear more about which regions in Sweden you were mentioning. Thank you.
Yeah, it is the example that I was thinking about is the region Västra Götaland. They actually do not have a figure for their target, but they, in their regional plan, it's very clear that they want to direct that towards more transport efficient society. And that is what I know is one of the most clear examples from the regional transport plans that they wanted to direct it in that way.
All right, thank you. Would appreciate to read it in the chat how to spell the region name. Thank you.
Yeah, I can write it.
Yes. So turning back to California, there was a lot of recognition from your last reflections there about that it takes time and effort to sort of make these strategies successful. And here in Sweden, we have similar organizational institutional barriers. Looking at your progress report and your conclusions from that, what measures do you see ahead? What tools are needed to strengthen the implementation?
John, did you want me to jump in, or?
Sure. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. It's been really great, both hearing the presentations and exchange. I'm Lezlie Kimura, Szeto. I've been around in California doing BMT work for a very long time. But to your specific question, we did put together the scoping plan with a lot of reflections about the challenges, about implementation, moving ahead. And I think that, I don't know that there's any top one. I think one of the things I was reflecting on with Kim's presentation is that, in any one place, there's so much to choose from, right? Because in order to move this VMT piece, you have to move the land use side, you have to move the transport side, you have to move with even what is on the horizon in terms of technology. And so it's hard for me to pick any one of those. What has been the most challenging here in California, I would say for sure, has been one, thinking about how do we figure out movement of the land use piece. And that is because I'm not as familiar with what your land use structure and authority is there, but in here, California, it is a very local matter, right? And so there is not a lot of reach in terms of what, at least in state policy, we've been able to affect, other than, right, what we have in 375 today has started the conversation about showing what the alternatives could be, trying to get regions to identify pathways, which are all unique across California because they come from very different economic, right, contexts. And so we have some areas of the state that are very agricultural based, some areas of the state that are very much like freight sector, urban, right? So they all are generating their economies based on very different models here. And so there's no one size fits all there either, which also makes the conversation very difficult. And I think here in California, moving that land use piece, initially the thought was, okay, well, we will at the state level try and move that by providing incentives around, thinking about, well, are there ways that we can maybe streamline the development processes to give incentives to folks on the environmental side, right, for the environmental review of particular projects. And maybe the state could fast track some of these projects that we deem to be in line with the plans that are out there that are good for GHGs. But that has become even harder, right? And I think part of the movement here in California has been, well, is there a way to simplify that so that it makes it a workable process, a workable incentive for folks? But I think landing on that definition in California that everyone agrees on, these are the projects and these are the locations that should deserve this type of incentive moving forward has been a difficult conversation, though I think not one that has been concluded yet, and one that I think will continue to churn through in the state for the next couple of cycles. The other one clearly will be transportation, and I think some of you brought this up already in your conversations, and it's well, where do we invest in our transportation system? And if we're saying that we need to reduce VMT, and yet we still see a lot of our investments going into projects that we know the research shows will increase VMT, let that be additional roadway, highway projects moving forward, how do you change that balance here, right? I think we have all the folks saying that they want to also likewise put the same amount of effort in these other multimodal infrastructure pieces, but the structure of a lot of the funding pieces that we have here in California are heavily weighted towards roadway investment. How do you change that, right? And I think there are ways that we have tried to get at this, and we're still continuing to do that. And so a recent effort here at CARB has been to try and go in and look at even at the state level, right? Our peers at, you know, the Department of Transportation and others, we're talking with them and we're trying to identify, like, are these projects really aligned with our state goals of reaching climate, you know, and BMT reduction? And, you know, there are difficult conversations that have to happen about the quantification of those things. How does one evaluate those things? Because, you know, I mean, I think it's been done a certain way for a very long time, you know, and I think there are very real conflicts and happening, and those are very live conversations that our agencies are having. And so, you know, I think part of that has been, you know, really trying to shine the light on, all right, what can we do in this space if we are serious about getting to BMT reduction? And at the state, our own state Department of Transportation is out there. How are we looking at the impacts of these projects? How are we explaining that? And, you know, and we even had, as John mentioned, right, like a very large state Department of Transportation plan out there that started looking at, well, even at a global level, we have discretionary funding programs within the state. How are they actually prioritizing money for these alternative things over the roadway expansion? So story is not done there. This is a very live conversation in California. CARB's role in of itself has been to really continue to elevate that, try and seek out, you know, where are those opportunities to really elevate change in that space, especially at the state level, right, where we play quite a bit. But we also know, you know, transportation investment, at least in California, the way that it works, and I don't know if it's the same in your countries, but, you know, every project of real significance anyways, is made up of basically a quilt patchwork of funding. And so there's always, right, a piece of state, federal, local dollars, and it may be the large share of that funding is mostly local, but no project moves forward without every piece of that. And so thinking about it from that strategic standpoint, I think that, you know, we feel pretty good about starting with where we know we can talk with our partners at the state level and thinking about how they, you know, really prioritize the money that the state is putting out there in terms of its investments.
Thank you. We have a question from Renee Mortensen. Renee, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. It's very interesting to hear you. One, I think, important question is, how can you long-term sustainably supply a big urban area with food? Here in Sweden, at least, we don't put that factor into the equation when we discuss urban development. I wonder how you do that in California, because you have a lot larger already built up area than we have. I mean, the more people you bring into an urban area, the farther away the last potato will have to come from. If you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, I can jump in on that. Thank you for the question. It's very interesting, and I really personally am intrigued by the question of how sort of the built-up cityscape and the natural lands, the working lands, the farmlands and ranches kind of fit together. I don't have an answer to your question, but let me share a few thoughts that are inspired by it. You know, we do see this question analyzed at the regional level to some extent when they're developing these sustainable community strategies that John was describing. Some regions, or in some cases different, you know, regions by the definition in the law, several will work together to create some sort of what, often the map of where growth and development will happen is called a blueprint. So they'll maybe refer to it as a green print or something like that. And there are a number of different ways that regions take on thinking about that question and trying to conserve their most valuable farmlands and ranch lands. We've done some looking at this in the tracking and reporting that John mentioned, the SB 150 report. We can drop the link to that in the chat, but we use a state resource called the Farmland Mapping and Monitoring, I think it's project, to look at the lands that have been mapped as particularly valuable farmlands, and to understand the extent to which growth is occurring in ways that then convert those lands to residential or commercial or other sorts of developed uses. So it gives us a sense of the trends in that area. At CARB, we are increasingly working to really recognize and incorporate into our thinking the values around carbon sequestration and other values of many different types of natural and working lands. And then at the state level, there's also, you may be interested in something called the 30 by 30 initiative, which establishes a state goal of conserving 30% of California's lands and coastal waters. So that has a lot of focus also on biodiversity, access to nature, climate resilience, but it's another area that the state is recognizing it. So that's a little, I understand you were really asking about quantity of food supply, and I don't have a specific analysis on that exact issue, but we are definitely really interested in how, different ways that regions are taking action to help conserve those valuable farmlands that help provide that food supply. I don't know if John or Lezlie have anything you might want to add, or if there's another question.
All right, thank you so much, Carey. Now I leave the word to Mari Jussi from Finland. You have a question?
Yeah, thank you. I'm Mari Jussi from Estonia National.
Sorry.
Yeah.
My apologies.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Very interesting presentations. All. Yeah. Thank you. I was asking whether California, do you have a specific review process for your highways development plans to in order to drop the ones that increase VMT? I'm familiar with the Wales review of their roads, and they have really like a systematic process for reviewing their road schemes. And like Håkan's presentation was saying that they have dropped certain schemes. How about California? Thank you.
So I can start off there if you want.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Okay. So yes, there is review under a couple of different areas. So there is environmental review that comes under our California Environmental Quality Act. Okay, and generally what would happen in there is that in the past, right, someone would look and they would say, well, is the impact having to do with actual like congestion or something? And then that changed, right? Because in California, then we had a new law that was signed in, which was SB 743. 743 now looked at the impact having to do with VMT impacts moving forward. And that has triggered a lot more in terms of question and activity in California about, well, how should that analysis be done for basically transportation and land use projects that get put forward in California in particular. We have a bunch of guidance that's been put out by our Department of Transportation that has to do with doing some of this traffic analyses for particular projects that come up. And I would say that You know, there is still a lot of back and forth here in California about, you know, how exactly does that get applied? Is it working for people? Because the result becomes, okay, well, how do I look at induced travel for many of these projects? How do I calculate it? What is the right answer? And once you get to an answer of like a number, let's say a VMT that this project is inducing, how much mitigation or what types of mitigation, or how do you quantify that? So yes, in a way, there is this thing there. There's no, I'd say, central state body that is looking at everything. So it is basically up to everyone who is even public, others who are interested in a particular project to bring up these issues, right? And that is something that I lightly mentioned, but CARB is also really looking at, one, the evaluation guidance that is being put out there for this and how it is being implemented. And what we're seeing so far is, like I said, you know, varying ways in which this is being interpreted as projects.
I wonder if you could say more about the method that is used in Wales that you referenced. Did I get that accurate? I thought it was Wales.
I can provide links to that.
Yeah, we could give some link to it, but what they actually had a panel of 8 experts in different fields that looked through the national the Wales plan on, and then they also they gave a large number of recommendations, but there were some of the recommendations that were criterias how to choose between if does this project fits into the strategy or does it not, and in some cases so. And it's important also when you stop these, as I said, that could have been on the table for a very long time, that you very fast discuss also alternatives, because many people have longed after these projects and waited that they should start, and then you have to discuss, okay, what would we do instead of building this road?
So what came out of this review that was initiated by the Welsh government was a series of recommendations for specific projects, and they were halted during the review. Some will be picked up again, but in modified shape. Some are put aside, and alternative solutions will be suggested, because as a result of the review, the Welsh government came up with principles for road investments. There is not a general stop for road investments. Road capacity investments can be made if they contribute to biodiversity and to reduced carbon emissions. So that's the governmental recommendations. I think you can all find the different documents and recommendations in the chat, but it's quite in the forefront, I think, these recommendations that were developed.
Yeah, thank you for posting that. I look forward to taking a look at that.
And in the chat, we also have some input from Benoit. I hope I pronounced this right. Benoit from France. Are you with us? And you had some interesting remarks?
I don't know if I have some interesting remarks, but I'm very pleased to hear what I'm listening to, and this need to, we have to recognize that we're not going to solve climate change without serious reconsideration on the way we travel. And this is why I pay attention to any effort to manage mobility. And I work for the French Ministry of Transport, and now all what we do is under the umbrella of ecological planning. And once you start to approach planning, we know where we need to land by 2050. There is a whole suite of evidence. And one of them is, yes, we have to go electric, but not with SUV. We have to go electric with light vehicles. And we still have to use them less. So what I hear from John, from California, and from the rest of the conversation is great. And there is a long list of things that we need to do, but frankly, this is not being well shared today in the transport world. So I just hope that we can reinforce this type of conversation, because electrifying and moving to just EV will not take us to where we need to go. We have to seriously manage demand. We have to encourage light vehicle, travel less, and we are quantifying that, by the way. And I was highlighting that for the next ITF summit in May, we and the Dutch government are joining forces to organize a joint event just to present the approach of ecological planning and the highlights, the findings that, yes, the solution is in the management of demand and lighter vehicle and so on. So I'm just happy to hear that there is a lot of allies in California, in Scandinavia. So maybe I'll be in touch with some of you to maybe just encourage more conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you for the comment. And if you do want to reach out, we can put you in touch with, there is a whole subsection of our division. There's about 80 of us in total, and the 3 of us here today are from one of 4 different groups. And there's a whole one of those groups that really focuses on zero emission vehicles. And we'd be happy to connect them to further discuss that. And of course, to answer any questions we can answer with you as well.
And we have a question more to Håkan, I think, from Matt Friedman. Are you here? Matt?
Good morning.
There are you.
I'm with the California Department of Transportation Division of Aeronautics. And so we are discussing quite a bit about electrification of aviation. That's another topic. My question is, for in Sweden, what is the public interest and public support for the decrease in vehicle travel, solo vehicle travel, and acceptance of other means of transportation?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm the right person to answer that. I think the Swedish EPA are doing this kind of investigation about the public interest. But I don't know if you have asked that. I mean, we are more looking from a perspective from the sustainability, that you need to reduce this the greenhouse gas emissions, of course, but also the VMT. So it's how large the public support is for it depends on where in Sweden, of course. But I think that is also that in more urban areas, there is, of course, a support to reduce traffic, because there you also see the direct benefits of it. In more rural areas, there is, I think it's, as I tried to explain, that if you have a national target to reduce the traffic with 20%, then maybe the larger cities take a 30% reduction, and more in rural areas, you maybe do not need to reduce the traffic at all. So because there it would probably not be a support of reducing traffic, and there is no need to do so. Also, and the alternatives to the car there is not as as large, even there are people that do not want or do not have the possibility to use a car. So you also have there to work with alternatives.
I can elaborate a little on that. I think in general, when you come to a specific measure in a specific area, there is opposition heard because people don't want to change, and maybe they are afraid to lose easy parking in the city center, or they don't like road charges. I mean, we introduced road charging in Stockholm 20 years ago, and there was, of course, effective debate before, but then there was a referendum after introducing the trial, and the referendum was positive. So there is more sides to it than just the groups that are in opposition, because if you make polls, recently there was a poll showing that many Swedes want to have more livable, walkable city areas with reduced car traffic. So there are two sides of this, both to look at the larger picture and not only the groups that are good at being heard, because they may be the groups that can lose something, like the cheap parking or the extra car lane, but also take into account what can you do to facilitate this change in their lifestyle. And I think you in California, you mentioned to look at vulnerable groups and how to support them, like financially, maybe with reduced prices in public transport or something. But yeah, take into consideration that there are always opposition, but if you dig deeper, there may be acceptance, but it depends on how you package the measures and how you communicate, and most important, give the opportunity to try, because the practical experience is very important. Like, it was not a disaster. So
yeah, I think that Johanna said is on the Stockholm trial on the congestion charging is a very good example of if you let people try and then they see the benefits of the reduced traffic, and then it's much easier to accept it. I mean, that is the basis of tactical urbanism, that you work in that way. And we have other such examples in Sweden. We have had this summer streets in the urban areas. So started in Stockholm with only 2 streets that are closed for car traffic in the summer, and then made it to a very nice street to sit down at the restaurant and walk and cycle and so on. I don't know how many streets is it now. It's is it 80 streets or something like that? So it really has developed them when people see the benefits of it. So.
Mm-hmm. So we are approaching the end of this webinar, but I do have a question on my own, and it's when you look at the highway planning in California, do you also, like in Sweden, have economic models that prioritize travel time savings by cars, and that this is a bit of a method that can be a hurdle to look at alternative ways of accessibility?
The answer is yes. Although I think we have made great strides in talking more so about, also different ways of analyzing projects. And this mostly comes up when we are thinking about, the very real funding discussions that happen. And so a lot of the collaboration work that goes on between ourselves and some of these other agencies who have the purse strings right? It's a lot of us trying to get in each of those funding cycles and the guidelines that precede them to really think about, okay, you know, like, how are we going to score these things? How are we going to ask folks to analyze these pieces? And so another arm of our agency's work is having people go in and participate in each of those, because in California, you know, each of the funding pots actually has a little different way of how they quantify the impact of projects for their funding purpose. And so in some ways, it's a little bit of us trying to be strategic about which funding pots we try to hit, because which ones will likely have more impact on projects in particular. But yes, that is generally an area of interest for us.
Okay.
And it does post
some recognition there.
Yeah.
Okay, I think Karin has a final question. Please, Karin.
Well, yes, I like to add something about acceptance, about charging in Stockholm. Vital to get acceptance that we had lots of buses so people could have alternatives. And people here said it before, you can't just close car traffic. You have to offer alternatives. I think that's crucial for acceptance.
Thank you, Karin, for that remark. We have a few minutes left, but I think there are no more questions for the time being. And yes, Hannah?
Yeah, there was a recent study in Sweden showing that measures to reduce car dependency in Sweden depends on, I mean, the acceptance for it from the public depends on how just they are. So for example, I mean, even though the persons who were not directly affected, they also cared about the people who were affected. So it was very interesting.
It raises the issue of fair transition and just transition, I guess, which is very important.
Yeah, thank you for both of those comments. It's the issue of, we don't use the term acceptance as much, but it is a very good term. I had in that word exactly. But I think, you know, really making it work for Californians and all Californians, you know, in a just way is very important to us.
So we have a few minutes left, but I think we are approaching the end of this webinar, and I would like to extend a huge thank you for John, Lezlie, and Carey taking the time to give this presentation and provide us with very interesting information about all your work in California, and to Håkan for bringing in the European perspective, and to all of you that have been listening and contributing with interesting topics and questions in this discussion. Yes, thank you very much for attending here today. And
thank you for organizing it and for having us. I know I've enjoyed the discussion and appreciate all of you being here and you for organizing it. So thank you very much.
Thank you for an excellent session. Really, really, really insightful and interesting. See all the work's going on both in the US and elsewhere.
Thank you, Barry. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good day in California and a nice evening in Europe. Bye.
Bye.